Welcome, everyone. Please feel free to introduce yourself and share where you're joining from in the chat. We would really appreciate a really active chat today, because today is all about coming together and celebrating the success of the consensus statement on HIV bodily autonomy, surveillance, and informed consent, or BASIC. And that means celebrating our community and our comrades in the fight for HIV justice, health data privacy, human rights, and freedom from state violence, in addition to so much more that we'll unpack in this webinar. My name is Amir Sadeghi. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Manager at the Center for HIV Law and Policy, or CHLP. We're an abolitionist legal and policy organization working to build a world where people living with HIV and people living with other stigmatized health conditions are no longer criminalized, but are met instead with compassion and the resources to thrive. There's our website on your screen. Please follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, Instagram, and anywhere else you choose to receive updates about our work. Today's webinar is called Beyond HIV BASIC, Organizing for Privacy, Dignity, and Freedom from State Violence. And we're hot on the heels of the publication of the consensus statement on HIV BASIC. So we're here to discuss what's next for the HIV BASIC Collective and the framework it uplifts. So just really quickly, this QR code on your screen will take you to the consensus statement on HIV BASIC. Please, if you haven't already, consider joining us in this movement, in this campaign, in this grassroots effort to celebrate, this analysis. So this discussion will serve as an introduction to the foundational principles of HIV justice through the lenses of bodily autonomy, informed consent, and human rights. Together, we'll explore what these concepts mean, why they matter for people living with HIV and fellow advocates, and how they strengthen advocacy, reduce stigma, and support the dignity, leadership, and self-determination of all people, while building a coalition of advocates across the US and the world. Today, we're joined by Michael Scarce and Melanie Reese, co-chairs of the HIV BASIC Collective, whom we'll hear from first. We're also joined by Kamaria Laffrey, co-executive director of the Sero Project, Kelly Flannery, policy director, and Barb Cardell, leadership development coordinator, both with PWN USA. So Michael, I'd love to turn it to you to really get us started. And why don't we keep it basic? Why don't we keep it simple? What is HIV BASIC?
Hey everyone, thanks for joining today. I'm so excited to be here to talk about HIV BASIC. To talk a little bit about it, I'm going to start things off by talking a little bit about our history and how we came together. And also extending an invitation for anyone who is interested to join us. So HIV BASIC came together in late 2025, early 2026, but it's really just sort of the latest step in an evolution of a group that already existed prior to that. Prior to being HIV BASIC, we were known as the Molecular HIV Surveillance Work Group, and it formed around 6 to 7 years ago after learning that the CDC was going to be unrolling a practice called molecular HIV surveillance, which I'll just refer to as MHS for short. And essentially, the CDC basically imposed a restriction on HIV prevention and treatment funding, contingent on rolling out the practice of MHS. And for those who might not be familiar with MHS, it basically involves the following. So anyone who is HIV positive and is about to start treatment medications, it's just a standard of care for us to get a genetic resistance test to figure out which medications and treatments will work for our individual mutations of our particular HIV. It's very individual and body specific. And at some point, about 15 years or so ago, a group of epidemiologists figured out that they could take that genetic sequence from one person's body, compare it to the genetic sequence of another person's body, and determine if they were directly related. And although MHS does not determine directionality in terms of who infected the other person, they can see that two people are directly linked, that one person had infected the other person. And they realized that they could use that information to identify clusters of HIV that were emerging in our communities, and that it could be used as a tool for public health surveillance. When our communities found out about that, we were justifiably alarmed, in part due to criminalization concerns of what that medical information could mean, how it could be used to police our bodies, the fact that it was being done routinely without our knowledge or awareness or consent, the fact that it was rolled out with all of these strings attached in ways that we were excluded from that process. It created an enormous sense of personal violation of our bodies, of our privacy, as well as our bodily autonomy. And so this group came together. Originally, it was a subcommittee of a larger committee that was part of the U.S. Caucus of People Living with HIV. As that advocacy work got started to push back against molecular HIV surveillance, we had decided that we wanted to be able to respond more quickly, more nimbly to things as they were unrolling without having to go through a lot of committees to get a lot of approval and an organizational sign-off for things like issuing statements or press releases, speaking to the media, and so on and so forth. So it became kind of this autonomous coalition, a collective of people who really galvanized around this particular goal. And what the MHS work group was really asking for was just a set of ethical guardrails. We wanted to know how this information was being collected, where it was being stored, who would have access to it. We wanted to know if it could or would be shared with law enforcement within a context of HIV criminalization. There were a whole slew of very legitimate concerns. This culminated in 2022 when this group really spearheaded an effort to get a resolution passed through the U.S. Presidential Advisory Committee on HIV and AIDS, calling for a moratorium. So that group is, the acronym for that is PACHA for short, for people who might not be familiar with it. And that call for a moratorium, that resolution passed by PACHA. And even though the CDC decided not to fully act on that resolution and adopt all of the recommendations that were in it, we were wildly successful in changing the landscape of everything from public health practices around privacy and surveillance issues to the fundamental ways in which this kind of science and research is even conceived and conducted. Shortly after the PACHA resolution, there were even a team of researchers who had received a large federal grant to do a molecular HIV surveillance research study. After participating in our group and speaking with folks in our group, consulting with us, they actually decided to scrap their entire research study proposal. And instead, they wrote and published an article about their decision to abandon that research project. And instead, they chose to write about all of the ethical quandaries that were bound up with it and came up with a set of recommendations for how that work could be done more responsibly. And I just have to say, like, that almost never happens with federally funded research projects, where people come up with a study design, get a bunch of funding, and then back away from it entirely after realizing that there are some real ethical problems that are hard-baked into that study. So in late 2025, we found ourselves mired in the hellscape of the Trump administration. But something I think more important happened along the way in those early years of the MHS work group, is that we had a core group of people who began to think more broadly about all of the intersecting issues with MHS. So we talked about bodily autonomy. We talked about state surveillance. We talked about privacy. We talked about informed consent. And a number of us kind of got a crash course and became relative experts in those areas. And we began to have these larger conversations about what does informed consent even mean within a context of HIV prevention and treatment? How do we access the resources and care that we need while keeping ourselves safe and keeping each other safe? So we kind of felt like that we had hit a wall with not getting anywhere with the CDC in 2025. People were feeling a bit burnt out by that. We weren't getting much done in the way of changing federal policy, but we decided that all of these intersecting topics that had come up, that they continued to be incredibly relevant. And I know that Kelly will talk about the current landscape in just a few minutes. So we decided to sort of reformulate ourselves and rebrand ourselves as HIV BASIC, with BASIC standing for bodily autonomy, surveillance, and informed consent, with a focus on how they are deeply interconnected, as well as how they interconnect with larger concerns around data privacy. So I'll just read this, just a short excerpt from the introduction to the consensus statement, talking about how all of these elements come together, that they form the foundation that dictates whether an individual has a right to self-determination over their own body and personal data. Bodily autonomy is the fundamental right to make decisions about one's own body and life without external interference. And then informed consent acts as the required and necessary ethical and legal mechanism to ensure that any action affecting a person's body is done with their full understanding and explicit permission. And then privacy comes into the mix as providing the necessary protective space for exercising bodily autonomy. So we drafted the consensus statement earlier this year. We launched it at AIDS Watch, and it has been enormously successful. We've had everyone from individuals to smaller nonprofits to some of the larger HIV advocacy groups sign on to the statement and adopt it and commit it to the principles of doing their own work. And we're just really excited to use this webinar as an opportunity to officially launch that effort, to talk more about what we're all about, and then begin to look to the future and how we can continue this really important work. And yeah, I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Michael. And I just wanted to say we're already getting some great questions in the chat. I want you to know we will be turning to your questions. I've seen them in the chat when we open it up to Q&A. So Melanie, I'd love to bring you in now. You know, I think this is actually, Michael just set us up really well. I think this is a perfect time to dig a little deeper on the themes that Michael introduced. So can you share why HIV BASIC matters for people living with HIV?
Yes, I can. HIV BASIC matters to people living with HIV because we are, one, subject matter experts of living with HIV, and we want to be informed every step of the way in our medical care. In fact, we are active partners in our medical teams. And what we want to talk about should be the topic of discussion when you're at your appointments. And that people living with HIV come from many communities. And all those communities are over policed, they're over surveilled, they're over, everything is over what happens to us as people living in communities, people desiring to thrive in communities, people wanting to be productive for their communities, and the general society at large. And one of the things that I believe is excessively important is the meaningful involvement of people living with HIV in all things related to HIV. And I don't think the HIV world has a handle on what that really means. And in fact, it really should be meaningful leadership of people living with HIV with paid, as paid experts. Um, um, Not consultants, not after the fact, but we need to be at the decision making tables. We need to be at the, I heard a few months ago at a conference, we really need to be in the kitchen before we get to the table. So early on in any process, people living with HIV need to be involved. We know what living with HIV is like. We know what living with HIV is like with other co-occurring chronic conditions and life situations like substance use, mental health, um, intimate partner violence, uh, sexual assault, uh, all kinds of life and societal issues are all wound up in those of us living with HIV. So we're not only experts in our living with HIV, we are experts in all intersecting factors in society that make us vulnerable to acquiring HIV. And so MIPA didn't just start, it started with the Denver Principles in 1983. The Denver Principles outlined how people living with HIV need to be involved in every area of HIV. Uh, Partners in their treatment care. What are interventions and programming? What does it look like to be successful for people living with HIV? And then other examples, the ACT UP movement. They took it in their own hands to get medicine approved quicker, get medicine and access to medications and treatment. They had a big movement where they acted out in ways that they could be seen and heard and not pushed to the side. And the USPL HIV caucus, in preparing for the next iteration of the national HIV/AIDS policy, they painstakingly, along with the 7 anchor organizations and other people who worked to make this document demanding better. We've gone beyond asking, we're demanding. And even demanding doesn't seem to be enough. We're going to have to do something besides demand. Although we did get that into the national HIV/AIDS policy, getting it there isn't enough. It has to be put into active practice throughout the HIV world. And the basic bodily autonomy, surveillance, informed consent. We need to know up front what is going to be happening to these results that are going to come from these lab tests that are taken. And most of the time we hear, oh, we're going to keep up with your CD4, make sure you're still undetectable with your viral load, and see how other things are occurring in your body that can impact your overall HIV stats and your overall well-being. And what came about in the national HIV/AIDS policy was we wanted quality of care to matter. We need quality of care to be measurable so that it can be determined what kind of quality of life are you having. And this is something we're still working on. And in order for that to be a reality at some point, those of us living with HIV or AIDS need to be planning the how is it going to be measured? What areas are going to be measured, and how it'll be coded, or um, uh, the cumulative coding to determine how these are going to be measured. And don't forget, economic justice. We are not $5, $20, $50 gift cards is not economic justice. Having a meal card or a bus pass, or in some areas they get cards to get gas for their automobiles, or a box lunch or a pizza, that is not economic justice. We are experts, and we need to be compensated as an expert. And to get to the end of the HIV epidemic, what's in place now won't get us there, because they have not asked those of us who are living with HIV/AIDS what is important for us to help ourselves and others want to be involved in our healthcare, want to become virally suppressed, want to help others in encouraging them to be involved with their healthcare team. And not after the fact, not midway into a designing a plan or a program. At the beginning, we need to be there giving them our thoughts that need to be addressed in the process of getting down to a program or intervention that is going to work. And remember, I said it says meaningful involvement, but that's doesn't get to the meat of what we want. We want leadership, and we want to be front facing with scientists, researchers, journalists, anyone who can get our information out front for the public to see and hear. That we know how to present ourselves, we know how to speak about topics that are important to us, and people need to know we're not some low life, lower level society people. We come from everywhere, all levels of life, all levels of society, and we're very intelligent, and there were circumstances that we were all found ourselves in that got us to the point where we had to hear the words, "You are HIV positive," but that didn't mean that we were ignorant and non-intelligent. Just whiling through life with no cares or worries. We are mothers, grandmothers, uh, wives. We are co-executive directors. We are executive directors. We are um, community leaders. So we need to be meaningfully involved with the I moving to an L for leadership. And we need to be compensated as an expert. And that's why HIV basic principles are important to me and should be important to everyone who is living with HIV or AIDS, anyone who loves those of us who are HIV or AIDS, those who care for those of us who have HIV or AIDS, and those who want basic human rights for everyone, and they don't want harm to come to anyone. You need to be fighting for HIV basic principles. And um, right now, I've drawn a blank. So, Barb, what did I miss?
Yes, no, actually, Melanie, thank you so much for, setting the record straight, right, on misconceptions about MIPA. And yes, Barb, please, I'd love to pass it to you.
Oh,
Yeah, absolutely. Melanie, that was such a great foundation in reminding everyone why it is so important for us to include people living with HIV when we're talking about really anything that is planned to impact our lives. Especially around things like data protection and molecular HIV surveillance, and why HIV BASIC is so important. This is a movement that is led by people living with HIV and our partner organizations. So the part I want to drop in here is to talk about a little bit about working with people living with HIV around stories on data protection and molecular HIV surveillance. It is really important for us to be a part of these conversations and in leadership, as Melanie mentioned. But I can't tell you the number of times that most people living with HIV who are aware of molecular HIV surveillance and have tried to talk to health departments or the clinics or case managers and say, I'm concerned about this. And most of the time, the message you get is, don't worry, it'll be fine. It's very patronizing, and it minimizes our lived experience. It certainly doesn't elevate the important pieces that have kept many of us here living and thriving with HIV. Some days just surviving, but our determination and our desire to make decisions for ourselves, informed decisions for ourselves, and control what happens in our lives, and to have bodily autonomy. These are all pieces that Melanie and Michael actually mentioned. And this is super important because oftentimes people say, well, I'm going to involve people living with HIV in the storytelling part of it. When I hear storytelling, I kind of flinch a little bit because that to me sounds like a fairy tale. And that it is about tokenizing people living with HIV, saying, we're going to put you over here, have you talk about why this matters. But it's not going to be rooted in fact. It is not going to oftentimes, and we've seen this since the beginning of the epidemic, that the people living with HIV and our concerns are not elevated on the same level as clinicians, as researchers, when the reality is we have PhDs in HIV. Mm-hmm. Anyone who survives with HIV has a PhD in it. And we should, rather than saying that we're storytelling, especially in these advocacy areas, I would propose that we remessage it and that we actually say that instead of saying, I'm sharing my story, we say, I am here with a purpose-driven message. Because that to me reinforces how critical our voices are when we talk about how we've been engaged, how we've been impacted, and how we actually think about this. So that is the part that I just wanted to hop in here, since we were talking about reframing MIPA as including leadership development. I want to reframe storytelling and say that while it is absolutely critical, we also need to talk about it in a way that lifts up that expertise. So just wanted to hop in here and add that part as well. Melanie, do you have any thoughts you want to add about that?
I think what you just added is superb. And the storytelling. People are so wanting us to tell stories, but they're more than stories to us who are living it. And we want them to realize this. It's not, like you said, fairy tale-ish. It is real life. And uh, we need to be compensated appropriately for those stories, because in telling your story, you can become re-traumatized.
Yeah.
Those are real events that can occur, and we need to be able to do that and have whatever is necessary to get aftercare and do self-care after telling our stories. And everyone should be wanting to fight for HIV basic principles. Everyone.
Absolutely. And we'll actually have an opportunity to share some of our stories around data privacy and bodily autonomy towards the end of this webinar. But I think that right now, Amir, do you want me to just pass back to you?
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, you know, Barb, Melanie, and for everybody else here, please feel free to continue to you know, come on and check in with each other, because that's what really this whole conversation and you know, this discussion is about. So yeah, Barb and Melanie, thank you so much. We will be talking much more about this. But you know, right now, I think a lot of folks engaging and listening today, right now, are active, are organizing around the hostile landscape of increasing stigma, criminalization, surveillance, and that type of paternalistic public health framework that hurts our people, just like, you know, what Melanie and Barb, what you both were talking about. So Kelly, and then of course, please, anyone else feel free to jump in after. What does this work, HIV Basics work, mean in that context? You know, why did the collective choose now to organize around a statement of principles?
Yeah, thank you so much, Amir. And hey, everyone, my name's Kelly Flannery. I use she, they pronouns. I'm the policy director at PWN, and it is my utmost privilege to get to work with people like Barb, Melanie, Michael, Amir, and all of the other folks you haven't seen yet, like Maria, who are on this presentation. So we just had an amazing grounding on the history of how the MHS work group kind of transitioned into the HIV BASIC Collective from Michael, and what or how HIV genetic surveillance interacts with criminalization. And then we heard from Melanie and Barb about the foundation of MIPA that underlies this collective and why we put out this statement. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can understand our current landscape of surveillance, policing, and criminalization. Next slide, please. So the first thing I'm going to start us out by saying is that this isn't new. Rising surveillance, policing, and criminalization is not new in the US. From the beginning of the US until now, there's been persistent and disproportionate policing and incarceration of groups that are already pushed to the margins of society. Black, Indigenous, Latina people, immigrants, refugees, sex workers, people with disabilities, queer and trans people, and others with like outsider status. In other words, those whose like very existence is a threat to racial capitalism. And this includes criminalizing people with HIV and other communicable diseases as threats to the prevailing social order. So I think sometimes we like to pretend like healthcare happens over here and the prison industrial complex and tools of mass incarceration happen there, right? So we have care on one side and we have punishment on the other side. But as people living with HIV know, and other stigmatized communities know, in fact, there's a long history of lane crossing, where health systems, health care, health practitioners, health data are actually used in order to punish and control people. And I thought that one of the members of our group, Alexander McClellan, who wrote Criminalized Lives, HIV and Legal Violence, did a really wonderful job in their book. If you haven't read it yet, please do. I'm going to read the full quote because it's worth it. Public health does not operate in a silo. the blurring of boundaries between institutional domains of public health and the criminal legal system, or with other authorities, has the potential to produce combined forms of coercion, surveillance, and control. Repurposing private health information for police enforcement and investigations underscores how people living with HIV are subject to the combined forces of policing and public health measures. This context can result in invasive forms of surveillance, regulation, and control that are focused on monitoring sensitive health information and sexual practices instead of providing support or creating environments of care. Next slide, please. But we are in a unique time, right? Policing, criminalization, and surveillance of health is not a new phenomenon, as I said, but at the same time, the coincidence of surveillance and criminalization, the violations of bodily autonomy and informed consent that we're seeing are a growing threat. And it's a growing threat that actually ties us together with other movements for justice. And this is a part of what HIV BASIC hopes to cultivate. We are seeing eroding health data privacy protections and the weaponization of data, especially for communities that are already subject to rising criminalization and state violence. It's those same communities that are most under threat by the Trump regime. In the next couple of minutes, 10 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about 3 specific communities. I'm going to talk about people seeking gender-affirming care. I'm going to talk about pregnant people and those seeking abortions. And I'm going to talk about immigrant families. But please know that there are so many other intersections of this work that we're really excited and will be juicy to dig into. And over the next year, as we produce more, we'll be digging into those other intersections. Okay, I'm going to start us off with something that's just true. Abortion and gender-affirming care are safe, common, and trusted by major medical associations. But the political posturing, the stigma, and the moral panic that exists around abortion and gender-affirming care has led to increased criminalization, and state surveillance mechanisms help to criminalize patients, providers, and care networks. On the left-hand side, you'll see what I'm about to refer to. In July of 2025, Attorney General Pam Bondi announced that the Department of Justice sent more than 20 subpoenas to doctors and clinics to investigate healthcare providers that provide gender-affirming care to young people. These requests were invasive. They included demands around personnel files for hospital employees and personally identifiable patient information, including names, home addresses, and social security numbers for young people. They're clear violations of privacy. They further undermine trust in the healthcare system, right? Like, why would you go and seek out healthcare when you know that your information is going to be shared with a hostile government? And they increase the possibility of targeted criminalization, both on the state level and on the federal level. We have seen states and a lot of people fighting back. So in late October, attorneys general in 16 states actually filed an amicus brief asking the court to limit the DOJ's subpoena power to demand these private patient records, right? To say, like, please don't allow them to grab all this personal information. And in May, the Trump administration actually did give up the fight in relationship to a hospital near me. I saw someone else from Philly in the chat to celebrate this one, that the Trump administration gave up on CHOP, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. However, some states are not continuing on the fight. So according to what I've been able to find, I looked at the Kaiser Family Foundation. 27 states have enacted policies that limit gender-affirming care for young people, and 50% of trans youth live in a state that has enacted policies limiting access to gender-affirming care. Moreover, since Trump's second term began, at least 17 major hospital systems in 9 states and DC have paused, canceled, or ended gender-affirming care for young people, even in states where they are not banned. So this is an example of complying in advance, right? The fear of having information demanded, the fear of the Trump administration coming after you, and then not providing care that folks need to survive and thrive. At the same time, it's not just health conditions that are being criminalized. That is bad. It's also that healthcare workers are deeply implicated with how criminalization moves forward. So in a report from Pregnancy Justice, they found that reports made by medical professionals or hospital-based social workers were the most common basis for an arrest in pregnancy criminalization cases. In other words, Pregnancy criminalization cases started because a healthcare worker reported them. If you look at the pie chart on the screen, that's from If When How's report on self-managed abortions from 2020 to 2022, or sorry, 2000 to 2020. And that found similar things, right? If you look at the graphic on the screen, you'll see that about 45% of self-managed abortion cases came to the attention of law enforcement through care workers. These are the ways that care, surveillance, and criminalization impact people living with HIV, impact people seeking gender-affirming care, impact people seeking abortion care. It ties our movements together. And importantly, these reports were from before 2022. So this is prior to the Supreme Court decision in Dobbs. In the first 2 years since Dobbs, prosecutors have initiated at least 412 cases charging pregnant people with crimes related to their pregnancy, so pregnancy loss or birth. And currently, 13 states have total abortion bans and dozens of others heavily regulate abortion. At the same time as we're seeing states and prosecutors come after people for decisions made in relationship to their pregnancy, there are rising concerns about how technology is weaponized in service of abortion surveillance and criminalization. I'm hoping everyone on this call knows the risks in things like period trackers that contains data about when you have your period and when you don't, if that information is then handed over to the feds in relationship to a pregnancy outcome. Another case, in 2025, police actually used license plate detection software known as Flock to track down a woman who had recently received abortion care. I'm hoping that folks have heard about Flock on the news. They're everywhere. They're everywhere literally. They're on street corners, they're around neighborhoods, they're like on streets. And metaphorically, it's been in the news a lot because of cases reported around police abusing this Flock camera system to stalk and harass primarily women. They have about 120,000 cameras in every US state except Alaska, and they contract with about 7,000 law enforcement agencies, which is 40% of all departments in the United States. This search for this woman who allegedly self-managed her abortion included accessing cameras in states where abortion access is protected by law, like Washington and Illinois, and there was no subpoena to receive this information. So this is another example of how we have a sprawling surveillance state that can then be weaponized against people for decisions made in relationship to their health, their bodies, their reproductive futures. Next slide, please. All right. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the intersections of surveillance and immigration criminalization in ways that pull every single one of us in this call in together. The Trump administration is working hard to extract, control, and consolidate personal information through agreements between agencies, state governments, and private for-profit companies. As a little background here, state and federal governments hold just incredible amounts of our personal information. This includes things like tax information, Medicaid records, food stamps, wage history, student debt, records about your residence, voting, driver's license, vehicle ownership, and so much more. Now, this information collected is supposed to be contained in segregated databases, right? It's supposed to be used only for the purposes in which it was collected so that folks can have trust in providing their information to the state and federal government. However, in March of 2025, Trump issued an executive order directing the federal government to broadly share information and ensure that agencies have unfettered access to state data related to federally funded programs. So these are things like Medicaid and SNAP that get federal funding but are administered by the state, so the state holds a lot of that information. Now, the specifics of these consolidation efforts are still becoming clear, are still becoming untangled. There's not a lot of transparency, which I know is going to surprise no one on this call. But what we do know is that the Department of Homeland Security has become a very public player in the administration's efforts to consolidate data. So through things like data sharing agreements, ICE has tried to access taxpayer return information, including home addresses, public housing data, child support data, voter registration information, SNAP benefits, Medicaid recipients' personal data, potentially including health information. And I say that ICE tried to access this information because some of these attempts are getting held up in court. Folks are rightfully suing to say, that's my data. There needs to be safeguards. There are laws that protect our data. In addition to this sharing between federal agencies and sharing between states and the federal government, HR 1, some people call it the big beautiful bill. A lot more people call it the big ugly bill. My preferred favorite is the MAGA murder bill. HR 1 infused billions of dollars into immigration enforcement. And after that, DHS was able to use that money in order to buy access to a vast amount of sensitive personal data from data brokers. So this is information that's actually generated like online through your computer, through your phone interactions, and it can include things like location data, purchase history, health information, browsing histories. It's so much data that a lot of folks, when it was first happening, were like, I don't know, the federal government's kind of incompetent. I don't think they'll be able to actually process and understand all of this data and weaponize it, which was legitimate. A lot of our data structures are pretty old and cumbersome. However, in order to make sense of these troves of information, DHS actually contracts with Palantir. Palantir is a just like notorious data integration and analytic provider whose tools, according to the ACLU, quote, form the backbone for ICE's mass deportation regime. So right now, much of the context of the data integration from for-profit companies, from state governments, from federal governments, has really been used in service of supercharging Trump's mass deportation efforts. So it's been able to consolidate, bring together a lot of intimate information that has expanded the government's ability to indiscriminately target, detain, and deport immigrants. However, they are creating this broad mass surveillance dragnet. So this DHS integrated surveillance infrastructure is also going to amplify their ability to clamp down on people who oppose the administration's policies, something they've already shown us that they are willing to do. It can lead to intrusive data searches. It can lead to improper access by government agents, again, which we're seeing through Flock, and it expands the government's ability to target people they don't like for retribution. So these are kind of 3 examples of ways that we are seeing data collection, surveillance, policing, and criminalization tied together in ways that people living with HIV have been yelling about for years. Next slide. As a policy person, I feel like I almost always get like the explain the terrible policy, especially under this regime. And so I wanted to end us with a little bit of hope, or end this section with a little bit of hope. This quote is from Ruha Benjamin from Race After Technology. If surveillance tracks people like a surface, then countering this form of violent exposure can entail listening deeply to the everyday encounters of those who are forcibly watched. This points to a different way of making sense and knowledge of the world, a theory of privacy predicated on mutual respect and dignity. A big part of the why now for HIV BASIC is, yes, because we are in a horrifying hellscape of fascist overreach that includes surveillance systems that dig into our everyday lives and is built on racism, anti-Blackness, transmisia, homophobia, and all of the other ways that people living with HIV have been pushed to the margins. And the why now is because we have a moment to build together with other movements that also are experiencing rising surveillance and criminalization, movements for reproductive justice, for immigrant justice, for trans liberation and Black liberation. And so the why now both has a deep weight and acknowledgement that it is hard right now. Survival is hard. They are cutting systems we need to survive and increasing systems of criminalization. And we are stronger together, and our principles of informed consent, bodily autonomy, and ending the criminalization of all people will get us to liberation together. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Kelly. That was wonderful. And, Kamaria, I'd love to bring you in here. to, as someone leading the Sero Project, the HINAC Training Academy that we're all very excited about, someone who's involved in supporting the HIV decriminalization movement on such an intimate level, building the leadership of people living with HIV from the ground up, what can you tell us about how the consensus statement on HIV BASIC and this entire framework can be used in people's advocacy that they're already doing? How can advocates work together to get HIV BASIC on the map the same way that our, HIV criminalization reform advocacy has?
Yeah, thank you, Amir. I'm here, Kamaria, co-ED, half of a great team of co-EDs that are leading this organization, making sure, like to Melanie's point, that we're centering the leadership of people living with HIV. Our organization is led by people living with HIV, and bridging in this important conversation. So one thing was with like the rebranding or reframing, as Michael named, of MHS to BASIC was really inspiring, and it helped kind of chisel away at like the complications of how subject matter experts, people living with HIV, come to the table and also have to navigate the advocacy of their own lives while dealing with something that could be considered like a barrier to their care if they're holding on to the principles of I want informed consent. I want to know where this data is being held. So I'm really excited to be one of the organizations that signed on to the consensus statement and to be able to kind of model what it looks like to put this into practice. So for folks who may not know Sero Project, we lead the HIV Bodily Autonomy Training Academy with our other partners, this year being Positive Women's Network, the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus, and Positively Trans. And so we don't have a location just yet. We'll be announcing that soon. But through our partners, through the HIV Bodily Autonomy Training Academy, as well as the Health Net Prisons Collective, we respond from an abolitionist framework, and we move at the speed of trust within our various coalition relationships throughout the country. And I think we're in 15 plus states. I can't name the states off the top of my head because we respond to whatever the needs are as they approach. You can go to the next slide. And Michael named this earlier, that it was at HINAC 3 or 4, I can't remember which year, where we started hearing about MHS. And there was this kind of like unraveling of understanding advocacy approach to HIV criminalization. And folks kind of just sat with, what does this mean? How does it impact us? And so each iteration of HIV's Not-a-Crime Training Academy, we have been uplifting a space for this conversation. And so one of the things as an organization that I'm really proud that we get to do is continue to reframe our approach as we learn more and understand more, as things continue to change and things seem to be more challenging. How else can we convene folks to have this conversation? So I want to share 2 ways that Sero is inspired by the consensus statement and what putting this framework into practice with hopes that other orgs do the same, what that looks like. So one way is that when we're navigating the decrim conversations through state strategic planning, building in more stakeholders, identifying funding, doing more community education, and who should we be talking to and who shouldn't we be talking to. And as we take all those things into an account, sorry, I'm distracted by a phone call. When we take all those things into account, we really should be reframing how we ask the question. So I think Kelly spoke to why this question is so important. So it's not just, can this data be used, which is usually like the public health framework of they're just looking at the data and looking at it being used instead of asking actually who controls that data, who accesses the data, how is it being used, and what is the collective response when the data is being weaponized, as well as what other systems does our data intersect with that can lead to criminalization, that does lead to criminalization. And so one thing I would encourage folks to do, especially folks living with HIV that are sitting around at tables that are discussing budgets, that are discussing integrated plans in their state, or that are discussing expanding a funding opportunity, like some states that have experienced a recent ADAC crisis. There are some planning bodies that are looking at how do we reallocate funds to be more responsive to folks that are falling in the gaps that are not reaching the federal poverty level. You think those things aren't connected, but they are. So I tell people when they hear phrases like data consolidation, as Kelly named, or cost containment measures, look at how those statements are integrating into the actual implementation of a policy or program at a clinic near you, or how it's impacting your services. So really inspired to challenge communities and ask these harder questions is one way that Sero is going into our strategic planning to help different coalitions navigate beyond the legislative strategy. So this is also for states that have already made like a reform measure, like Iowa or California. There are still issues that are going on, as Kelly already named, where these questions need to be asked. As we've already named multiple times, intersectionality is a theme. Next slide. And so our second sort of reframed approach, or strengthened, I shouldn't say this a reframe, it's just more of a strengthening of an approach we already take, is to hold ourselves more accountable and aligned with community. And it might be better to see, I don't know if the other slide shows the image better. I was trying to figure out which slide to keep and which one to take out. So you have both. Thank you. So for Sero specifically, like this ecosystem of HIV is not a crime training academy, is the convening for where this space can really be chewed on. And we're not really talking and preaching to one another, but we can take these conversations and plant them in other spaces, like reproductive justice conferences. I think Let's Talk About Sex just convened last week. Like that's another space that may not be HIV specific, but you can be having this conversation. And so taking that from HINAC into state coalition capacity, which I've already named, is a lot of the spaces that we're in. And I think a lot of our responses to this administration's federal threats that are coming down, I think all of us here know that the best response right now is to go through our state channels. So please get out there and vote. Please get out there and talk to your candidates and see where their mindset is around different health practices. And so taking it from a state coalition capacity into your intersectional coalition partnerships, really, really sit with, if there's folks that you've already identified that are not at the table, instead of constantly talking about that they're not at the table, go to their table, go to where they are and have conversations and bring in this consensus statement, bring in this framework and talk about how they're impacted by that. And maybe that will help you evolve a better legislative outcome for everyone, because we're having a lot of situations lately where we're trending, where we're always leaving someone out and saying that we'll circle back and come back to them when we know that under this political climate, that is really, really unlikely, or it's going to be a huge challenge that we're not really prepared for. And so really sitting with, if you already named that someone's not at the table, reassess to why and see if this framework will help bring some alignment and solidarity. And that's one approach that Sero is going to be taking, as well as responding to what we call more complex cases. And I can't remember who named this already. I think Melanie did. But when you're thinking about HIV crim cases that involve non-consensual acts or that involve minors, are you having the conversations around data collection there as well? Because that's also about bodily autonomy and informed consent, and how the laws are currently written around informed consent really only land on one side of the argument around someone disclosing their status, but they don't look at the other side of if it's a non-consensual sex act, what sort of informed consent does that individual have? And that gets really sticky. I know I just kind of threw like a little bit of a bomb into the conversation, but it is something that Sero is sitting with while we're having this conversation as well, because all of this ties together for us if we're wanting the outcome to be liberation for all. And so that ties into the identifying and developing public health resources. And so creating messaging that can help folks navigate these really challenging cases and conversations that come up. And ultimately, my chronic optimism, that ties us into like taking our work from a consensus statement and a framework and putting it into practice within our coalitions for the outcome that we're looking for. So I will stop there, and also just give like a lot of appreciation to the other panelists that I'm with, and I will pass back to Amir for a Q&A, hopefully.
Yes, and thank you so much, Kamari. I love the way you ended things there. I actually think this ties in really well with something that Barb wanted to touch on a little bit. Thinking about transitioning from frameworks, from principles to practice. Barb, I'd love to turn it back to you to share more about best practices around advocacy and messaging on these themes that are at the core of HIV BASIC. And then after that, I promise for everybody, we will be doing Q&A. I have all of your questions. Please continue to drop your questions in the chat and we'll get to them. Barb?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Amir. And thank you, Kamaria. Actually, thank you, everyone who's been presenting. This is always such a deep topic and really meaningful. So, when we're talking about messaging, especially if we're shifting from talking about storytelling and actually having it be messaging, when we're talking about the impacts of molecular HIV surveillance, data gathering, and so many of these systems that really don't even want to meet our needs or elevate us as true partners, we need to make sure, again, that we go back and we talk to people who are living with HIV and ask what feels meaningful and what does not. And so for me, and I don't have best practices messaging guide for all of us. I think that's still in development as we're hearing people's stories and what they're sharing. But here's the framework that I would actually kind of suggest, is that when we're talking about messaging and we're talking about HIV BASIC, the most important thing to know is that most people don't know about it. It is something that people maybe have heard a little bit about, don't really quite understand, but certainly when we talk about it, we want to talk about it as using our data in ways that we do not consent or are not even informed about, that it impacts our agency, it impacts our privacy, and it impacts our right to control our own messaging on the impact. So those are sort of the things to think about in this framework around storytelling, now messaging. And I can go ahead and I'm actually going to ask other folks if they want to come and talk about how they, like when they talk about HIV BASIC, what do you bring up and make sure? And so for me, I'm going to go ahead and model and go first. For me, when I talk about messaging, I start off by what I actually put in the chat at the beginning of our session, which is that I literally remember in my body when I first heard about this. And I remember that, and so it was about molecular HIV surveillance. So it was about surveillance. It was something that the health department had approved years before, that they had been kind of just gathering up results from CD4s, viral loads, and this genotypic test that Michael mentioned earlier, and hadn't seen fit to actually share that with people living with HIV. Then I actually went ahead and started asking case managers and my clinician and my care team if they had heard about it, and they had not heard about it. And they actually thought that I was being alarmist, that couldn't possibly be the case. And so when we come back to this, there's a lot of gaslighting that happens when you're a person living with HIV, when you start especially kind of making connections to how we're being tracked, how we're being surveilled in ways that we might not even know. So I start off by talking about what that felt like to me, to know that my information was being shared with people that I had no knowledge of. Then I shift into actually knowing about it. And so then what do you do? And for me, I actually used it to make really critical health decisions. I was on a regimen that wasn't doing so great. But I knew that to switch regimens, my doctor required that I have this genotypic test done, which means that my HIV genotype would be reported to the health department and then would actually go to the CDC again. I wasn't willing to do that. I wasn't willing to have that reported one more time. And so for 2 years, I actually stayed on a suboptimum treatment regimen because I refused to have that test done. And we had some really difficult conversations, my doctor and I. However, I kept saying, this is what I can control. This is what I have power over. So by the system not being transparent about what it was using and how it was gathering, I now have lost my faith in the system. And that means that I do not engage in care to the level that you think that I should, because to me, it doesn't feel as if it is supportive or meeting my needs and seeing me as a person who should be able to make determinations about my own life. So when I talk about messaging, that's what I talk about, is I talk about how violated I felt, how violated our community felt. And people can, especially now, given how much data surveillance is going on and how many people are being surveilled in many different ways, whether it's with flock cameras or genotypic tests, most people actually can resonate with that message, and then to use it as a way to highlight my own determinations. But I think that actually, Michael, did you have a personal story that you wanted to share that sort of highlights how you talk about HIV BASIC and data protections?
Yeah, I do. And this is a story that got touched on publicly, like for the first time in a recent article that was in Positively Aware. Back in 2014, I first learned about molecular HIV surveillance. I was doing some research through the California Department of Public Health's Office of AIDS, and came across some regulatory documents where the California Department of Public Health was demanding that all genetic sequences from any genetic resistance test be turned over to them, that would be forwarded to the CDC for phylogenetic analysis, not to improve my care, but to be able to map social, sexual, drug-using networks between and among people living with HIV. And I had previously done research on the ethics of sexual networks amongst men who have sex with men, and found some really horrific stuff. And so I immediately understood the implications for that kind of a move, how that was going to be violating my body, how it was going to be violating my privacy. I was alarmed that this hadn't been spoken about publicly at that point. And I was just weeks away from getting my routine lab work done. And back at that time, it was a requirement to receive Ryan White funded services. It was a requirement that you had to have recent lab work and that you had to provide proof of that. So feeling really violated, being really alarmed, wanting to know more and learn more about how this information was going to be used that was taken from my body without consent, I deferred that lab test by a couple of months to buy myself some time to make sense of it and to try to make some decisions about what I was willing to disclose or not disclose. And as a result, my Ryan White recertification came and went, and I fell out of care. I would actually argue that I didn't fall out of care. I would say that I was pushed. And that set into motion a whole sequence of events of not being able to access my HIV meds, going off my meds entirely because I couldn't get them at that time, having to apply for Medicaid, which that application process at that time took months and months just to get a rejection. I had to prove that I had been rejected from Medicaid before I could even re-enroll in Ryan White, even after I had those lab tests done. And the whole thing just kind of snowballed and wrecked my life. I think many people who are living in poverty, especially folks who are accessing Ryan White services, if you've been there, that we live a life of precarity, where one small thing can just tip the scales out of balance and just have a cumulative effect that can just be really, really devastating. So I'm always mindful when I share that story personally to other people. I'm always mindful of this kind of delicate balance of wanting people to have information so that they know how their data is being used hopefully without freaking people out to the degree that they abandoned all of their care entirely. I remember so clearly trying to explain to my physician why I was deferring those blood tests. And later, I got a hold of all of my medical records for Social Security disability application. And I went through all of the notes that she had written from that time period and how she had documented that I must have psychosis because the patient harbors deep conspiracy theories. The patient says that the government is using his blood to track him and to follow him. And you can imagine just sort of like what that would mean later for other providers, to look back over my medical records and see something like that. And she was right. She was absolutely true. That's what I was communicating, but it actually was really happening. So when Barb spoke about the stuff about sort of like gaslighting and being treated as if these concerns are not really valid and not really rooted in a deep sense of violation, it kind of fuels my intent to always distinguish between the concepts of medical mistrust and medical distrust. And when I talk about medical mistrust, I talk about not trusting medicine, not trusting providers, not trusting public health institutions for reasons that are not grounded in fact or reality. When I talk about medical distrust, I'm talking about being wary of those same institutions based on personal lived experience, the experiences that I've had, experiences that my peers have had, that are incredibly valid, that are incredibly warranted. And so I'm hoping in the decades to come that the HIV movements are able to rebuild some semblance of trust with public health institutions in a way that we can work together in a way that everybody gets the care that they need without having to incur harm in the process or without having to make agonizing choices between privacy and life-saving care. So thank you, Barb. Thank you for sharing that and for your courage and vulnerability and talking about that.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing those stories, not stories, but, experiences, right? That I think we have to balance, all of these issues that we've talked about. And again, I'd like to invite everybody to come up on video here. Michael, no, please come back as I transition us towards Q&A, balancing what Melanie shared, right? That sharing these experiences can be re-traumatizing. So we need to focus on repair, on things, to restore advocates as they're sharing these experiences, but also recognizing, much like, Barb talked about, those experiences can affect change when shared, with policymakers, with stakeholders. And I think it's a really, important balance to figure out and ensure that we're building restoration and repair into the infrastructures that we use to do this work. So, I'd love to read a couple quotes from organizations that have endorsed the consensus statement on HIV BASIC. Again, just to remind folks, it's been endorsed by hundreds of organizations and individual advocates. But before that, there's actually a question in the chat that I think is so pressing on what we've been talking about, Barb and Michael, that I'd love to just read it for you, and then we can go to the quotes and show some appreciation for our endorsers. Ji Su, and I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly, If this method of molecular HIV surveillance, which again, is, as Michael mentioned, is a mandatory funded activity for all CDC grantees currently, and was rolled out in this really problematic way that Michael talked about, if that method cannot be used to determine directionality, the directionality of an HIV transmission, are we at least reassured that it can't be used for criminalization? Would folks like to touch on that question from the chat? I mean, I have my own thoughts, but I would love to turn it around to you all.
I feel like everyone knows this answer. Who wants to go?
So I'll just chip in
go ahead,
quickly
Mike.
with some of the latest science. So while molecular HIV surveillance and the genetic data that is currently collected in and of itself does not reveal directionality per se, scooping up the entirety of people's medical records and going through them, sometimes that can reveal directionality, right? So if you've got medical records from two different people, you know that one person tested HIV positive 10 years ago, you know that one person infected the other, and another person has recently tested positive, that's going to reveal like directionality right there. Currently, the genetic sequencing that's done on our HIV is from a specific region of the HIV genome. There's a lot of cutting edge research out right now that does whole genomic sequencing, that does look at a kind of like molecular clock, a clock that starts from the time in which you are infected, in which researchers are able to infer, maybe not determine with absolute certainty, but to infer directionality. And I know other people have additional responses to that question too. So,
yeah, I will plus one. I think it was Jim in the comments that said a hard no. No, we don't have any assurances that it can't be used for criminalization. And I'll share like another touch point of how this can hurt people living with HIV. So there's a person charged with HIV non-disclosure. I won't go into the details of like what their case is, but while they were going through the judicial process, they're in jail, they want their meds, they write to the judge to plead for, hey, I need my medication. Can you please just contact my physician? No response. The person continues to send letters, not realizing prosecution is stockpiling these letters and putting it in their file because this person is also detailing, if I'm not on my treatment, I'm not going to be I'm going to become detectable again. And now they're timelining when they were and when they weren't. And that then opens up a deeper pathway for folks to dig deeper into medical records and figure out other victims. I don't mean to do air quotes, but we don't ever know if people are actually, there's hardly any cases where actual transmission occurs in many of these criminalization cases. So all of that gets opened up to a scrutiny that ends up getting used against the person living with HIV instead of in support of them getting access to their care and their bodily autonomy and their quality of life and so on and so forth. So no, it just continues to hurt us instead of supporting our quality of life overall.
And if I can throw in one additional from kind of like a policy legal analysis wise. So first off, I'll just name that like there's a really wide variation of health data privacy protections in states across the US. So I strongly recommend that you take a look and figure out what are the actual health data privacy protections in your state. And they can range from being like relatively protective, like DC does try to prohibit molecular or genetic HIV surveillance data from being used for policing and criminalization. Other states go so far as actually requiring that health departments work with police in cases. And so there's a really wide variation. All of this is to say, no, the information is generally not legally protected. There are folks who have worked on some kind of model legislation to try to ensure that health information only be used for health purposes, not for criminalization, not for immigration enforcement, and not for civil matters without your direct consent. And then the other thing I'll note specifically around HIV genetic surveillance is that like judges and juries are not scientists. So there have been times where the underlying research of the underlying analysis of MHS, phylogenetic analysis, actually has been introduced in courts in order to kind of further insinuate someone's guilt. And so while it's like scientifically not dispositive, that doesn't mean that judges and juries won't hear that and say like, oh, I think they showed transmission. It's just not, it's not a perfect system.
Yeah, Kelly, thank you for bringing that up, because that is absolutely correct. We had a case like that in Colorado where somebody who was living with HIV and had been for a long time was actually cited in a case by somebody who had been more recently diagnosed. And they actually brought in molecular HIV surveillance that showed that it wasn't likely that that had been the person they had acquired HIV from. But as soon as the jury and the judge heard HIV long-term, they started talking about the person who was the defendant in ways that were so horrific. And I mean, like, absolutely, it goes back to the AIDS monster, which we all remember from the 80s and 90s, and how horrific and dehumanizing that was. So again, it goes back to the stigma, the gaslighting, and the way that people living with HIV are often perceived by systems that are able to really do harm.
Yes, thank you, Barb. And Michael also has an additional comment in the chat that I think is really important for a lot of the international audience here who's tuning in. So I'd love to just move us forward really quick to celebrate, as you know, we're still doing Q&A, so I promise we're going to answer some more questions, but I just want to take a quick moment to, you know, acknowledge and celebrate the cross-movement organizing that the HIV BASIC Collective has been engaged in. So we've just been joined by so many wonderful endorsing organizations, you know, and hundreds of individuals as well. But here's just a comment I'd love to share from Prachi Dave. I hope I'm saying that correct. Senior Managing Legal and Policy Director of If, When, How Lawyering for Reproductive Justice, so a reproductive justice organization. And as you know, Kelly and others have shared, there's some really important intersections here between our work and attacks on bodily autonomy in the context of repro. So as people working at the intersection of state violence and reproductive health, If, When, How has seen violations of people's privacy and informed consent in healthcare be used to criminalize people for their pregnancy, pregnancy loss, or birth. We joined HIV BASIC because everyone should be able to access healthcare in safety, with dignity, and without fear that seeking help will be met with punishment. Healthcare providers must be safe places that we can all turn to for care, not surveillance. So I just, you know, it's just incredible to see the solidarity, but also just the analysis and values that the HIV Collective brings to this work, reflected in so many of our sibling movements. So I'm just going to read one more quick quote, and then I'm going to turn it back around for questions. So the next quote is from the Electronic Privacy Information Center Consumer Privacy Program Director and Senior Counsel, Sarah Gagan, someone who's a friend of mine, a colleague, a comrade. EPIC supports HIV BASIC because privacy should be baked into health systems and shouldn't be treated as a luxury good. Health privacy abuses and breaches put vulnerable communities at risk and discourage people from seeking care. But building a better world with less commercial and government surveillance is possible. Establishing robust data protections with purpose limitations will improve health equity and outcomes. So again, just talking about how we turn these values in this analysis and the experiences of people like you listening into practice. And here are some really important ideas like purpose limitation and data minimization, and so many other things. So I'd love to raise a question here in the chat. This really, Kamaria and Barb, I think this was a question asked during your portion of the conversation. Marginalized groups are also going to be wary of being at the table with authorities who hold that power. They're exposing themselves to being directly targeted. How do you help these groups to bring their lived experiences to the table and maybe feel safer when doing so?
I'll jump in and start just by I don't like asking people to do things that I'm not willing to do. And I used to be the co-chair of the Ryan White Care Council. So in doing that, I learned the hard way, don't challenge these systems alone. Always have some support. Let someone else know that you trust, that's at the table. Like, hey, you don't have to speak up. I'm going to take the bullet for now. But if they come for me, then you have my back. Like, have some sort of agreement. So I did have a dear friend who is no longer with us, but I did have a dear friend who always had my back. We play, like, horrible analogy, but we play good cop, bad cop. So I did the innocent thing of like, but why are you doing this to us type of position? And then they would come in like barking and yelling at the next meeting. So we kind of had like this back and forth balance of how we did it. But then, you know, people, of course, see us coming and know what we're doing. But my encouragement is like, don't go at it alone. There's a whole network of folks that can support. So making sure that you have like a collective team built and put together to help you sit at those tables and be safe in doing that. So that's just one example I'll offer, and I'll let Barb and others weigh in as well.
Yeah, Kamaria, thanks for lifting up those examples, because I think that it is really critical for us, especially now, to think about how we both elevate the messaging and the lessons that we're learning from these communities. I've been having lots of conversations recently with transgender people living with HIV who really want to share their stories, but it's very unsafe in the United States because of this current fascist regime and their erasure and the harm that is being invited into these communities. So, you know, definitely when we are here as organizations, but also as individuals, we need to acknowledge that disclosure is very complicated. It is a personal choice and it's very complicated. We are here as a community. And so anytime there is someone else in the space who can step up with you, you know, even if you're standing at a podium, there have been a number of times where people have stood and pushed back against health departments. And there have been 3 of us standing at the podium. Only one person is speaking, but there's been 3 of us because nobody should stand alone. That's one of the things. The other thing is I always make sure that folks know that disclosure and sharing their messaging, sharing their stories even, is a gift that they can decide to do or not to do. And that if it feels in the moment that it is unsafe, that they can always go to, I have a friend. Because hopefully we all love ourselves enough to say that you are your friend to yourself. And so saying, I have a friend who has shared that this is their experience, and then to be able to go into the details at that point in time, because you're not really lying, but you are just talking about it in a third person kind of way that then gives you a little bit of safety. But for those of us that do the organizing in the HIV BASIC, and especially when we're mobilizing people who are living with HIV in marginalized communities, we need to make sure that there are ways for people to participate that are safe or safer, whether it is an anonymous forum to add your comments or to talk about your friend, or to come and find one of us and we can talk about our friend, because, you know, like I said, we stand together in this.
I would like to add that thank you, Barb, for stating the example. One person was speaking at the podium, but 2 others were side by side, so they weren't left alone. That makes for a brave space. I don't believe in safe places, brave spaces to share your message. And the other thing I was going to say is the third person, your friend or someone that you know, that's another good way of sharing the message without feeling that you are going to be the only one targeted. For those who don't believe your message, who don't believe that people living with HIV are human beings or whole people, that they are just the disease. So it's very important that when we do teach and advocate for people to tell give their message or tell their story, that we give them those added information so that they can make a informed decision when it's time to share.
Well, thank you so much, Melanie. And, we're at time, and, I would love to just thank everybody attending for participating today. We at CHLP are really proud and excited about being, an organization supporting the HIV BASIC Collective and your work. And so just thank you all. This will, a link with this recording will be sent to you. But for, Michael and Melanie, I think there are probably a lot of people here who'd like to stay in touch. How can people who've been tuning in, who are really excited about the work you're leading, stay in touch?
So if you signed up for this webinar, there should have been a little checkbox for staying in touch with HIV BASIC. If you sign the consensus statement as well, there's also a place where you can give your email address, and we're going to be rolling out sort of like an HIV BASIC coalition email digest to send out news, to talk about future events, and as a way of staying in touch with us and communicating with us and organizing with us. So we hope that you will tune in as well as join us. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael, Melanie, Kelly, Kamaria, Barb. Thank you all so much. And I hope you all have a restful rest of your day.